The night my grandfather ended up in a cast, I knew the line between community rules and straight-up cruelty had been crossed, and I also knew, in my bones, that nobody else was going to stand up unless I did. It started with a knock, 3 hard raps at the side door, and the kind of voice you only hear in movies, too polite, too rehearsed, saying they were from the association, that there'd been complaints. By the time I got to the porch light, my whole world smelled like spilled coffee and fear. My name's Mason Reed. My grandfather Eli Booker had lived on that strip of Jimson Road longer than the HOA mailing list existed. He'd built the porch swing with his own hands, fixed neighbors' roofs for cheap, and kept a stubborn garden that the Neighborhood Association's Aesthetic Standards Committee always hated. That house was not just timber and nails to him. It was a ledger of years, a map of Saturdays and small kindnesses. So when people started treating him like a problem to be managed, something in me snapped. At first it was petty, a notice about paint color, another about a non-conforming mailbox, 1,000 tiny bureaucratic barbs dressed up as concern. But there was heat under it, a developer's cousin on the board who wanted to tidy the neighborhood up for new buyers, a few folks who liked the way power felt. The HOA president, Vivian Hale, played the role like she'd been born into it. Calm, a precise smile, a wardrobe that inspired trust. She could make fines and meetings and votes feel like law. But behind that smile was a hunger for control, and when Eli wouldn't comply, her patience ran out. The night they came, they weren't wearing HOA polos. They wore uniforms that looked official at first glance, dark shirts, badges that glittered in the porch light. "Sir, we need you to step outside," one of them said. The words were clipped, practiced. When Eli opened the door, he moved like a man who'd seen a dozen standoffs over the years and thought he could handle one more. He asked for identification. They told him the badges were temporary, that the HOA had contracted enforcement. When he asked which board member authorized it, they laughed. It felt unreal, like something you'd watch online and say, "That would never happen here." It did. The first shove came quick. A warning turned to a scramble. Eli tried to pull back, and a man I'll never forget the way his jaw set grabbed his arm. The sickening crack of bone on wood was the kind of sound that makes every conversation stop. Neighbors in their windows, a dog barking twice, then silence. They left him on the porch with a note taped to the door. Further noncompliance will be handled accordingly. They drove off, leaving skid marks and a smell of cheap cologne. I could have called every number on that sticky paper and waited for someone else to fix it. I could have let it be one of those small-town tragedies that simmered into gossip. Instead, I found myself in a small emergency room, watching a nurse tape up Eli's forearm, hearing him joke through clenched teeth so the pain wouldn't look too big. I remember his hand squeezing mine, that old, stubborn grip, and thinking, we have to do something that refuses to be handled accordingly. Act 2 is where the story stops being a wound and starts being a plan. I spent the next week like a man with a secret to prove, pulling surveillance footage from our own doorbell, asking neighbors for exterior camera clips, piecing together timestamps. There were grainy frames that showed 3 men getting out of a pickup at the end of Jimson Road, moving with the ease of hired muscle. One neighbor, June, who sold pastries at the farmer's market, passed me a photo she'd snapped of a man leaving the grocery with a uniform jacket stuffed into a tote bag, a suspicious transaction number scribbled on a receipt. Small things, but small things pile up. And then there were the Ramsey boys. They weren't my family, but in this town the Ramseys were family adjacent. 2 cousins with local tattoos and a reputation for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. They'd grown up with Eli teaching them to fix engines. He'd once let them sleep in his shed when times got rough. When I showed them the footage in my kitchen freeze frames, close-ups of a badge that didn't match any county seal, they didn't ask for reasons. They simply said, "We'll ride with you." We staged 2 confrontations. One was at an HOA meeting where Vivian Hale presided over coffee cups and a glaring projector. I walked into that room with a USB stick and a trembling voice and put the footage up for everyone to see: the porch, the uniforms, the badges that read Association Enforcement but looked bought online. Vivian smiled that same practice smile and accused me of manufacturing drama. She tried to call it a smear, an isolated contractor, but you could see the room shift. People who'd been afraid to speak suddenly remembered their own tires slashed or letters with threats. Conversations started low at first, then louder. The mask cracked. The other confrontation was more dangerous and uglier, and I admit this straight necessary. The Ramseys followed the trail of receipts and license plates to a scrapyard on the edge of town, a place that smelled like oil and tired engines. There we found uniforms stashed behind crates, fake badges still warm from someone's pocket, and a roll of invoices with Vivian Hale's signature on the top line. The hired men, the ones who'd broken Eli's arm, were there too, surprised and angry in the way hired men get when they realize the gig is over. No one wanted to be the hero in that scrapyard scene. It was messy, pushed hands and shouted threats, and one man finally thinking better than swinging a wrench. The Ramseys did what they could without crossing the line into something darker. They recovered the evidence and filmed the confession of the foreman who'd organized the hit. When we walked into the sheriff's office the next morning, we had more than a story. We had timestamps, receipts, a recorded admission, and a list of bank transfers. The deputies who took the file were quieter than the ones who ran the prank show's online efficient, used to weirdness, and not impressed by an HOA's supposed authority to enforce outside legal bounds. Impersonation, assault, conspiracy, those were the words that finally put the weight of the law on our side. Vivian Hale had a lawyer. She posted statements about misunderstandings and rogue contractors. But the ledger doesn't lie, and paper signed with your name is paper you can't pretend you didn't sign. The legal fallout was public and ugly. The board voted her out amid a storm of angry emails and an emergency meeting that lasted longer than any funeral I'd been to. People who'd been silent for years stood up and told stories, small, humiliating things that made the pattern clear. Some neighbors cried, others clapped. Eli's name came up as mom-and-pop hero material, the man who fixed roofs, who taught kids to fish, and the neighborhood remembered what it meant to be more than a line on a tax form. But here's the part they don't put in the headlines. Justice felt complicated. Vivian Hale was escorted away in cuffs, and I stood on Eli's porch, watching the deputies speak to him about press statements and victims' rights. Eli, being Eli, wanted to shake her hand. Not because he forgave her, he had every right to hate, but because he wanted the thing to end without feeding more hate into the world. You don't have to be mean to be right, he told me that afternoon, eyes crinkling like rope. But you do have to keep your hands to yourself. There were quieter payoffs too. The Ramseys got a call from a neighbor they'd once helped and received a box of dinner and a handshake. June's Bakery sold out that week. The HOA reformed its bylaws to add transparency, small legal scaffolding built so power couldn't bend the rules toward private ends. It wasn't a perfect fix. Machines of control are stubborn and inventive. But the neighborhood learned something about solidarity. When people show up with receipts and each other, the pretense of legality gets exposed. The climax, the scene that feels like a movie, was Vivian's arrest. She left her house under a sky that looked suspiciously like dusk, the light flat and judgmental. She had that same careful smile on, but the hands that held it were shaking. As the cruiser took her away, a few folks on the sidewalk clapped and others turned away. I remember thinking that public shaming is a dangerous medicine. It heals some things while leaving scars in others. Justice had been served, yes, but the cost was the raw truth of how easily neighbors who rely on each other can be turned into actors in someone's tidy little plan for profit and control. We wrapped the story in court filings and press releases, but the part one keep replaying is small and human. Eli on the porch weeks later, his arms still stiff, sipping coffee as if he'd rather be anywhere than center stage. He said, "We keep the porch clean, Mason. That's how we show what we're made of." And in those words was a lesson. Resistance doesn't have to be violent to be fierce. It can be slow, steady, legal, and inconvenient enough to stop a bully. So what do you do if this happens to you? I'm not here to give a how-to, I'm telling you what we did, imperfect and messy. We collected evidence. We asked friends for help. We didn't let the story be buried in silence. We pushed until somebody with a badge listened. That's not revolutionary. It's stubbornness, the kind that shows up at 2 a.m. with a flashlight and refuses to go home without answers. If you stayed with me this long, I want to know what you think. Was Vivian an outlier or a symptom of a system that lets people hoard small powers until they feel entitled to hurt others? When does sticking to the rules become a weapon? And how does a community stop letting power hide behind polite language and meeting minutes? Drop a comment, tell me where you fall on right and wrong, how you would have handled it, or if you've ever had to stand up for someone like Eli. Share this if you know a neighbor who needs to be reminded that keeping watch literally, with cameras and records matters. And if you like the story, subscribe for more real, messy, small-town reckonings.